There was a time when the world bowed to the power of the South, a time when the sun never set on this empire. Yet few remember that this empire was not born in glory, but in shadow, in poverty, and in the constant fear of downfall. How could it happen that a few fragmented kingdoms, which once lived under the pressure of powerful caliphates, united and rose to become the first true world power in history? And why did this empire shatter only a few centuries later? What remained was a tired state, exhausted by wars, ground down by uprisings and internal strife. This is not a story of gold and glory alone. It is a story of faith, of the dream of unity, and of a historical lesson that occupies Europe to this day. In this film, we take you on a journey through the history of the Spanish Empire. From its hesitant beginnings in the mountains of Granada to the palaces in Madrid, from America to Asia, from sky-high triumph to the quiet tragedy of decay. It is the story of Spain, and yet, at the same time, the story of Europe, of humanity, of hubris, and of the limits of power. Let us begin where everything seemed almost lost. It is difficult for us today to imagine the Spain of the early Middle Ages. No united kingdom, no pride in a common identity, no concept of a Spanish nation as we would later know it. Instead, the Iberian Peninsula was a fragmented tapestry of small Christian kingdoms in the north, Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and Asturias, which eyed each other with suspicion, while in the south, a powerful, highly developed Islamic civilization flourished, Al-Andalus. Muslim Spain was not only a bastion of military power but also a center for science, art, and administration. Córdoba in the 10th century was one of the largest cities in Europe, with public baths, libraries, and medical facilities, while in large parts of the Christian north, illiterate knighthood prevailed. It is an irony of history that Christian Spain grew precisely through centuries of contact with the enemy in the south. The constant confrontation with the caliphates forced the small kingdoms to evolve militarily and politically. Yet this development was by no means linear. Again and again, they faced total annihilation. For instance, in the 10th and 11th centuries, when the Caliphate of Córdoba reached its greatest extent, sacking Christian cities, driving kings into flight, and extorting tribute. A striking example of this threat was the Battle of Alarcos in 1195, when the Castilian king Alfonso VIII suffered a devastating defeat against the Almohads. The fear that Christian Spain could be erased was real, not only militarily but also culturally. In some regions, Christians were forced to take Arabic names, pay special taxes, or live as so-called Mozarabs in an Islamic world that left them less and less room. And yet, the history of Spain is a story of endurance. The Christian kingdoms learned to let their rivalries rest at times, to forge coalitions, and to face the overwhelming opponent together. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 marked a turning point. There, a united force from Castile, Navarre, and Aragon defeated the Almohads. Not because they suddenly had superior weapons or troops, but because they began to see themselves as part of a larger cause, the reconquest of the land, the Reconquista. But the path to unity was still long. Often, conquered territories were not celebrated as a common success, but as an occasion for new power struggles. The kingdoms competed for influence, war booty, and control over the rich, fertile plains of central Spain. The dream of a united Spain did not yet exist in the 13th and 14th centuries. Every court pursued its own interests. The crown of Aragon looked more towards Italy, Castile was entangled in internal noble struggles, Navarre isolated itself, and Portugal finally took its own path. A common mistake of today's observers is to see the Reconquista as a linear, goal-oriented campaign. In truth, it was marked by setbacks, internal disputes, and shifting coalitions. And even when only a small Muslim emirate, Granada, remained, the outcome was by no means certain. For at that time, at the end of the 14th century, the Christian kingdoms themselves were weakened by succession disputes, plague epidemics, economic decay, and political instability. Yet it is precisely in this phase that the final chapter of the Reconquista begins, a chapter that marks not only the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new Spain. For now, at the beginning of the 15th century, a young generation enters the stage. The children of those princely houses who would soon fight no longer for local supremacy, but for the soul of the peninsula. And so this chapter ends not with triumph, but with a historical pause. Spain had almost fallen, but it was not yet lost. In the next episode, we look at two figures whose fate is inextricably linked with the idea of a united Spain, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. The couple that wrote history. Sometimes a single decision changes the course of history. When Isabella of Castile agreed to the marriage proposal of Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, no one, not even the two themselves, suspected that this would lay the foundation for a new European great power. It was not a romantic connection in the modern sense, but an act of political foresight and mutual respect. Both were young, ambitious, and deeply rooted in their faith. But above all, they were united by a common goal: the unification of their kingdoms into a stable, powerful order amidst a torn and threatened Spain. At that time, Castile was the most populous and economically strongest kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, while Aragon possessed a well-organized state system and territories in Italy. The marriage between Isabella and Ferdinand was therefore not only dynastically clever, but also geostrategically significant. Nevertheless, it was by no means undisputed. Isabella's brother, King Henry IV of Castile, had intended a different marriage option for her, a political maneuver that she opposed. Isabella resisted. She insisted on the right to choose for herself, and she chose Ferdinand, with a secret marriage contract and a clandestine wedding in Valladolid. This self-determination was extraordinary for the time. It already showed Isabella's strength of character at a young age, which would later make her one of the most influential monarchs in Europe. Together with Ferdinand, she did not become the ruler of a united Spain, for formally Castile and Aragon remained separate kingdoms with their own administrations and laws, but she became the driving force behind a common political project. The two ruled together but separately, a model that required great sensitivity and yet succeeded. They complemented each other in many ways. Ferdinand was an experienced military strategist, pragmatic and diplomatically skilled. Isabella, on the other hand, was deeply religious, educated, and visionary. Together, they brought order to their disrupted kingdoms, reformed the judicial administration and the tax system, strengthened royal authority against the nobility, and created the basis for a centralization of power that had not existed in this form on the peninsula before. Their common project was not only internal, however. Externally, they aimed for the completion of the Reconquista, the reconquest of Granada, the last Muslim emirate, as well as the opening of Spain to the world. It was Ferdinand who, through clever marriage alliances, influenced the European power structure, and it was Isabella who gave Columbus the trust and the ships to sail westward. A common misconception is to portray Ferdinand as the dominant partner in this relationship, an image long maintained in historiography. However, modern research shows that without Isabella's leadership, her political instinct, and her uncompromising determination, the unification of the kingdoms would hardly have succeeded. She was not only the Queen of Castile, but a shaper of the future. Their marriage is a lesson in power sharing, strategic thinking, and shared visions. It shows that political partnerships, when based on trust and goal orientation, can have a tremendous impact. At the same time, it remains ambivalent, as many decisions of this ruling couple, such as the introduction of the Inquisition or the expulsion of the Jews, were profound and consequential, both for Spain and for Europe. But for the moment, at the end of the 15th century, it was their unity that made Spain strong. When they finally conquered Granada and brought all of Iberia under Christian control, they had achieved the unimaginable. They had united a torn country and given it a new self-image. But what happens when religious zeal and national pride begin to gain the upper hand? In the next chapter, we follow the struggle for Granada, the last bastion of the Moorish world, and ask ourselves, what does a final victory cost if one sacrifices diversity for it? On the morning of January 3, 1492, people stood on the hills of Granada in tense silence. In the distance, the banner of Castile could be seen waving over the walls of the Alhambra, while Boabdil, the last emir of Al-Andalus, handed over the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. It was a moment of immense symbolic power, not only for Spain but for all of Europe. After nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule, the Reconquista was complete. The Christian monarchs had reconquered the last remaining Muslim emirate, and with Granada fell a cultural mosaic that had long shaped Europe. The conquest of Granada was not a spontaneous decision, but the result of a carefully planned 10-year campaign. As early as 1482, Isabella and Ferdinand began the systematic siege and encirclement of the emirate, which had maintained itself for decades through tribute payments and diplomatic skill. However, Granada at this time was no longer the flourishing center of art and science it had once been under the Nasrids. Internal power struggles, economic exhaustion, and isolation from the rest of the Muslim world had weakened the emirate. The Christian attack was not unexpected, but it was inevitable. The siege was not only a military undertaking, but also a psychological war. The Catholic monarchs built a siege camp Santa Fe directly at the gates of Granada, a symbolic city erected in the shadow of the Alhambra to show the world, we are not giving up. Parallel to this, Muslim cities in the surrounding area were systematically taken. Granada was cut off. When Boabdil finally surrendered, he did so not out of cowardice, but out of realization. He wanted to preserve his city and its cultural heritage from total destruction. A common error is to portray the capture of Granada as a bloody catastrophe. In truth, it was initially comparatively peaceful. The capitulation treaty guaranteed the Muslim inhabitants religious and cultural rights. The Catholic monarchs promised to respect their mosques, their language, their clothing, and their traditions. These agreements testify to a remarkable degree of political wisdom, at least in the first moment. But as so often in history, such promises proved fleeting. Only a few years later, forced conversions began, along with restrictions on the Islamic way of life, and finally, in 1502, the prohibition of Islam in Castile. Many Muslims converted ostensibly to Christianity but continued to practice their faith in secret, the so-called Moriscos. This development, triggered by the growing influence of the Inquisition and the desire for religious homogeneity, laid the foundation for deep-seated tensions that would occupy Spain for centuries. Historically considered, the fall of Granada was a turning point, not only for Spain but for the identity of Europe. With it ended not only a war but also an epoch of religious and cultural coexistence that, despite all conflicts and tensions, had lasted nearly 800 years. The idea that Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together in cities like Toledo or Cordoba was now finally a thing of the past. The conquest of Granada brought Spain immense symbolic power. Europe celebrated the return of the Christian order, and Pope Alexander VI granted Isabella and Ferdinand the title Catholic Majesties. Yet the question remains, what is lost when unity is placed above diversity? In the next chapter, we turn our gaze to another historical decision of that same year, a journey across the sea that would change not only Spain's fate but that of the entire world. A certain man named Christopher Columbus stepped onto the stage of history with a dream that was larger than the known world of his time. Some years mark the course of history like a burning arrow in the dark, and 1492 was one of those years. For Spain, it meant the end of a centuries-long war. For Europe, a triumph of Christianity, and for the world, a turning point whose consequences we feel to this day. While in Granada the keys to the last Muslim bastion were being handed over, A few months later, a small convoy of ships left the Canary Islands heading for the unknown. On board was a man named Christopher Columbus, who firmly believed he could find a western sea route to Asia. But instead, he stumbled upon something no one expected: a new world. The decision to support Columbus was by no means a given. For a long time he had petitioned European courts, only to be ridiculed, stalled, or rejected. Even Isabella and Ferdinand hesitated at first. After all, his undertaking was risky, his calculations questionable, and the outcome highly uncertain. But in 1492, things had changed. The reconquest of Granada was complete, the power of the Spanish monarchy consolidated, and the crown was looking for new ways to expand its influence, especially to compete with powerful Portugal, which had already made great strides through its voyages of discovery along the African coast. It was not just a spirit of adventure that sent Columbus to sea, but a complex web of political calculation, religious mission, and economic ambition. The famous keywords, God, gold, and glory, describe it aptly. When Columbus landed on an island in today's Bahamas on October 12, 1492, he was convinced he had reached the eastern fringes of Asia. He called the locals Indians, a mistake that became stubbornly embedded in the language. What followed was not a peaceful encounter between two worlds, but one of the most consequential confrontations in history. The colonization of the Americas began with a mixture of curiosity, violence, and religious zeal. Columbus himself was removed during later expeditions for mismanagement and brutality toward the indigenous people. And yet his journey became the symbol of a new era, European expansion beyond known boundaries. An often overlooked aspect is the simultaneous expulsion of the Jews from Spain, also in the year 1492. With the Alhambra Decree, Ferdinand and Isabella ordered all non-converted Jews to leave the country. Tens of thousands lost their homes, many fled to the Ottoman Empire or North Africa. This decision was not only religiously motivated, but also political. They wanted to create a unified Catholic society, a project closely linked to the self-image of the new Spain. However, it was also the beginning of a deep cultural impoverishment. Sephardic Jews had for centuries shaped the intellectual, economic, and medical life of the country. 1492 was thus a year of contradictions, rise and exclusion, hope and destruction, the beginning of a world power and the loss of diversity. It was a year that opened new horizons, but also broke old bridges. What remains is the realization that progress often demands a price. Spain now entered a new phase. No longer just a defender of the faith on the peninsula, but the bearer of a global mission. But what happens when faith, power, and wealth become ever more closely entwined? In the next chapter, we look at the ideological foundation of this epoch and ask, was it really God driving Spain forward, or something else entirely? When people think of the Spanish Empire today, they think of galleons full of silver, magnificent cathedrals, and the sound of Castilian commands in far-off lands from Mexico to Manila. But what was this meteoric rise based on? Was it faith alone that drove Spain? Was it the urge for glory, or simply the hunger for wealth? The truth lies, as so often, in the intertwining of all these motives. God, gold, and glory is the formula often heard. But a fourth always belongs, unspoken: violence. After 1492, Spain stepped out into the New World with a double claim. It saw itself as a messenger of the true faith and simultaneously as the legitimate heir to the riches slumbering beyond the ocean. The Reconquista had shaped Spain like almost no other historical project. For 800 years, war had been waged in the name of the cross against the crescent. This experience was deeply etched into the collective self-image. Military success was interpreted as divine confirmation, possession as a reward for piety and courage. Thus, it is not surprising that the early conquistadors viewed their conquests as a continuation of the Reconquista, just on another continent. Hernán Cortés, the conqueror of the Aztecs, wore not only a sword and musket, but also a cross on his chest. And when Francisco Pizarro subdued the Inca Empire years later, he had the symbols of pagan faith burned and churches built upon their ruins. The message was clear: where Spain ruled, the true faith should triumph. But faith alone does not fill ship holds. The greed for gold was at least as present as religious zeal, and often hard to distinguish from it. In a famous quote, historian Stanley G. Payne puts it succinctly: in the Hispanic ideology of expansion, the spread of the faith was inseparable from military glory and economic gain. It is therefore futile to ask whether the conquistadors acted more out of piety or greed. Both were one. A good example is the search for the legendary 7 Cities of Gold, a myth that triggered expeditions into what is now northern Mexico and Arizona, often with catastrophic results. The idea that somewhere unmeasurable wealth was waiting to be discovered, or rather taken, inspired countless men to risk their lives and, often enough, to take the lives of others. A common misconception is to portray Spanish expansion solely as brutal subjugation. In reality, the situation was more nuanced. Many missionaries genuinely sought the conversion and education of the indigenous people. Cultural hybrid forms emerged, and some viceroys tried to prevent abuses. But the structural imbalance, a system in which Europeans judged, subdued, and viewed the newly discovered peoples as inferior, was deeply anchored. The lesson that emerges is uncomfortable. An empire can be simultaneously inspired by faith and driven by greed. It can bring light and cast shadows. Spain entered the world stage with the claim of bringing civilization and salvation. But all too often, the weapon came first, then the cross, then the treasure chest. This close connection between mission and power would shape the nature of Spanish colonialism for centuries. And it led to a dramatic chapter of history that we examine more closely in the next section: the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires. 2 advanced civilizations that disappeared within a few years while Europe rejoiced. But what does it mean when entire civilizations are wiped out in the name of a divine order? They were not classic soldiers, not official bureaucrats, and certainly not selfless missionaries. And yet, they were to become the defining figures of an entire age, the conquistadors. Men like Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, or Pedro de Alvarado crossed the oceans in the early 16th century, not on the orders of a strategic general staff, but often with royal permission, yet at their own risk and with their own goals: wealth, fame, and immortality in the history books. But who were these men really, and what drove them? Many of the early conquerors came from the lower nobility, which in Spain had little chance for land or titles. The Reconquista was over, knighthood was unemployed, and the New World offered a stage to prove oneself. A typical example is Hernán Cortés. Born in 1485 into a well-to-do but insignificant family, he began his studies in Salamanca but dropped out to turn to adventure in the Caribbean. What awaited him later in the Aztec Empire was not a product of chance, but a targeted, systematically prepared undertaking, militarily skillful, diplomatically refined, and brutal in its result. With only a few hundred men and by exploiting existing enmities between indigenous peoples, he achieved what seemed unthinkable: the capture of Tenochtitlan, the capital of one of the most powerful empires in America. The same pattern was repeated with Francisco Pizarro in Peru. He too was not a trained strategist in the classical sense, but a determined adventurer with an unshakable will. In 1532, in the so-called Battle of Cajamarca, he captured the Inca ruler Atahualpa. Not on an open battlefield, but through an ambush during an audience. The ruler was released for a ransom and then executed anyway. It was an act that shocked even contemporaries, but for the conquistadors, the end justified the means. A common error in today's portrayals lies in simplification, viewing the conquerors as unscrupulous monsters or as heroic pioneers. The truth is more complex. Many of them were both brutal and admiring, deeply religious and power-hungry, cruel and fascinated by the strange world they conquered. Some even tried to cooperate with indigenous elites, took local women as wives, or had them baptized to gain trust. At the same time, however, they brought forced labor, betrayal, and systematic destruction, aided by diseases against which the indigenous population was defenseless. A comparison with other colonial powers shows that British expansion was organized more efficiently in the long run, and French expansion was often more diplomatic, but none in its early phase was so strongly shaped by individuals as the Spanish. This brought Spain rapid territorial gains but also enormous structural weaknesses. The administration of the new realms lagged behind the conquest, and corruption and self-interest dominated, a price for speed. The lesson that remains: great deeds often arise from small motives. The conquistadors wrote history, but they did so mostly in the service of their own legend. But what happens when the gold of the New World finally flows? When galleons flood the ports of Seville with silver, wealth seems limitless, and yet the beginning of internal decay begins. In the next chapter, we take a look at this paradoxical development: how wealth becomes inflation, how power grows into exhaustion, and why the great Spanish gold was both a blessing and a curse. When the first heavy crates full of silver from the New World were unloaded at the port of Seville, people in Spain believed they were at the beginning of a never-ending source of wealth. The mines of Potosi in the Bolivian Andes and Zacatecas in Mexico rapidly developed into true treasure houses, fed by the labor of countless indigenous and later African workers. Precious metal flowed in streams to Europe, and with it grew the dream of eternal prosperity. But this dream was deceptive, for the gold and especially the silver of the Spanish Empire was not a foundation for sustainable strength, but the beginning of a dangerous imbalance. Potosi in a very short time became the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, a place where hope and exploitation intersected. The so-called Mita system, adopted and intensified by the Spanish colonial authorities, forced indigenous communities to provide labor for the mines. Under often inhuman conditions, men toiled at extreme altitudes in dark shafts for hours without a break, constantly threatened by collapses, mercury poisoning, or exhaustion. Death was a constant companion. It is said that so much silver was taken from Potosi that a bridge across the Atlantic could have been built from it, and next to it, a second one made of the bones of those who died in the process. But not only silver moved across the ocean. To keep the massive colonial machinery running, millions of people were abducted from Africa. Spain was initially hesitant to participate directly in the slave trade, leaving this business for a long time to Portuguese merchants. But with growing demand, Spanish participation also rose. The so-called asiento license, the monopoly on slave imports to Spanish America, was later even granted to British companies, a bitter proof that economic interests were often placed above moral and religious principles. A widespread error is that the wealth from overseas made Spain strong and modern. In fact, the opposite occurred. The massive influx of precious metals led to inflation that ruined domestic production. Why invest, why produce, when silver could be imported? The Spanish economy forgot how to support itself. Craftsmanship and agriculture decayed, while the nobility financed their lifestyle through colonial income without their own value creation. Other countries learned faster. The Netherlands and England began to use colonial profits specifically to build infrastructure and industry. Spain, however, consumed and lost itself in a deceptive bloom. The silver fleets increasingly became targets for pirates and wars, devoured resources, and the state became increasingly indebted to foreign lenders. By the end of the 16th century, Spain had officially declared state bankruptcy 3 times, despite, or perhaps because of, its apparent treasure house across the Atlantic. The lesson to be drawn is universal: wealth without structure, expansion without internal reform, power without measure. All this leads not to endurance, but to decay. Spain was the first global empire, but it carried the seeds of its overextension from the beginning. But how did it look beyond the economic side? How did Spain react to the growing responsibility not only to manage treasures but also to convert souls, shape cultures, and dispense justice on another continent? In the next chapter we encounter a ruler who embodied this tension most clearly. The mighty Charles V, the emperor over an empire where the sun never set and over a world he was not quite able to master. When Charles of Habsburg ascended the throne of Castile and Aragon in 1516, he was just 16 years old. A stranger in a land whose language he did not speak, whose mentality was foreign to him, and whose abundance of power he probably could not yet fully grasp himself. And yet, this young man was to become the most powerful ruler of his time in just a few years. As King Charles I of Spain and soon after as Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he ruled a world empire over which the sun literally never set. From the Netherlands to Peru, from Sicily to Vienna, from Mexico to the Spanish possessions in North Africa, hardly any ruler before or after him could command such a wide-ranging empire. But power alone does not mean control. Charles was a ruler in the field of tension of European conflicts, religious upheavals, and colonial challenges. His life was a permanent struggle for balance between Spanish interests and dynastic duties, between Catholic orthodoxy and growing Reformation, between administration and war. While his subjects in Spain hoped that their new king would be first and foremost their king, Charles viewed the empire as a whole, a body with many limbs whose needs he wanted to coordinate but did not always understand. An example of this was the revolt of the Comuneros in Castile. Scarcely had Charles set foot in the country when the Castilian nobility and urban bourgeoisie revolted against rising taxes, the preference for Flemish advisors, and the feeling of being ruled by a foreign monarch. The uprisings were brutally suppressed, a victory for the crown, but a first crack in the relationship between monarch and people. On the European stage, Charles was primarily confronted with two opponents: the French King Francis I, with whom he had a decades-long rivalry over territories and prestige, and the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, whose power in Eastern Europe grew threateningly. Especially in Italy, Spaniards, French, and Germans fought bitter battles, with varying outcomes, but ultimately with a clear advantage for Spain. With the capture of Milan and the crushing of French troops at Pavia in 1525, Charles secured supremacy in Italy. At the same time, a religious crisis was brewing in his German core lands. The Reformation under Martin Luther shook the unity of the Church and questioned the Catholic claim to truth. Charles, deeply religious and Roman Catholic to the core, initially tried to find a balance through talks and councils. But when the Protestant princes went their own ways, he resorted to a military solution, with mixed success. At the end of his reign, he had to accept a compromise in Augsburg that cemented the division of Christianity. An often underestimated aspect of his rule was the development in the New World. While Charles waged war in Europe, the Spanish colonial empire grew rapidly. The conquest of Mexico, the exploitation of Peru, the expansion of administration and mission, all this happened in his name, but often without his direct involvement. Spanish silver financed his campaigns, but the social reality of the colonies increasingly escaped control. The lesson to be drawn from Charles' reign is multi-layered. An empire cannot be held together by titles, bloodlines, or golden speeches alone. It requires understanding of regional differences, a sense of justice, and the ability to share or at least moderate power. Charles was not a tyrant, but he was overwhelmed. At the end of his life, he resigned and retired to a monastery, tired of the eternal traveling, fighting, and mediating. In the next chapter we turn to his son, Philip II, who not only inherited Spain but also led it into a new age, an age of pride, intolerance, brilliance, and slow exhaustion. What happens when a king understands himself as a tool of God? A look at the monarch who prayed more than he laughed and whose decisions helped decide the fate of Europe. When Philip II took over the Spanish crown from his father in 1556, the heritage seemed like it couldn't be any greater. A world-spanning empire with possessions in Europe, Africa, Asia, and America, an army that was feared, and treasure fleets that regularly returned to Seville with silver from the New World. Philip was not an adventurer like many of his ancestors, not a commander on horseback, and not a traveling emperor. He was a man of silence, a thinker in the shadows, deeply religious, strictly disciplined, and convinced that his claim to rule was of divine origin. But it was precisely this conviction, paired with an almost unshakable sense of duty, that soon became a burden. For Philip II did not rule over a unified empire, but over a variety of very different territories with their own interests, cultures, and traditions. While his father Charles V still personally mediated European conflicts and forged alliances, Philip ruled primarily from the Escorial, a giant palace monastery north of Madrid, which was simultaneously his symbol and his cage. There he wrote letters, drafted instructions, followed reports, and tried to direct the world from his desk. A central point of his reign was the attempt to restore the Catholic unity of Europe. He fought against the Protestants in the Netherlands, supported the Catholic League in France, and attempted the return of England to the Old Church through his marriage to Mary Tudor and finally through a military strike against her Protestant successor, Elizabeth I. But all these projects failed. Especially the uprising in the Netherlands, the so-called 80 Years' War, developed into a costly long-term conflict that overtaxed the Spanish military and permanently bled one of the wealthiest regions of Europe. The most dramatic moment of this religious policy was undoubtedly the defeat of the Armada in 1588. Philip had sent a massive fleet against England, around 130 ships, thousands of soldiers, with the goal of toppling the Protestant queen and restoring the Catholic heritage. But storm, English tactics, and organizational errors led to a fiasco. The defeat became a symbol not only for the limits of Spanish power but also for the growing self-confidence of England and the beginning of a new maritime order. A common mistake in historical consideration is to hold Philip solely responsible for this turning point, as if his piety and stubbornness had led Spain to ruin. But that is too short-sighted. Rather, it was a structural overtaxing. An empire that had grown too fast, an administrative apparatus that could no longer cope with the complexity, and a king who tried to control everything himself in a time when delegation and flexibility would have been more important. The economic situation exacerbated this development. Despite the continued influx of silver from America, Spain remained chronically in debt. The expensive wars, the elaborate court life, the constant subsidizing of the Habsburg network, all this led to ever-new loans from Italian and Flemish bankers. Several times Philip had to declare state bankruptcy, and trust in Spain's financial stability began to crumble. And yet, Philip II was not a weak king. He was a diligent, conscientious, and morally deeply convinced ruler. His problem was not a lack of commitment, but a lack of openness toward new realities. The world was changing, and Spain held on to old certainties for too long. In the next chapter we enter a time of standstill and internal strife. After Philip's death, a century begins that is marked less by expansion than by doubt. A century in which not the fleet, but the question prevails: who are we really if we are no longer the masters of the world? The 17th century began for Spain not with a big bang, but with a quiet, almost unnoticed fading. The golden era, in which Spanish ships dominated the oceans, silver crates stacked up in the ports of Seville, and the word of the king carried weight in Europe, was over, even if people in Madrid did not yet want to admit it. Instead of expansion and conquest, attrition, uprisings, and a long struggle with internal and external enemies now determined the rhythm of Spanish history. It was a century of exhaustion, and, at the same time a painful awakening. Already at the beginning of the new epoch, it became apparent that the price for the world empire had become too high. Philip III, who ruled between 1598 and 1621, acted far less energetically than his father. Instead of leading through his own visions, he left important decisions to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, a man who thought more about family enrichment than statesmanship. Although the first phase of his reign brought a short-term state of peace known as the Pax Hispanica, this calm was deceptive. The deep structural problems of the country remained unsolved: a battered economy, overloaded finances, social tensions, and a political system that increasingly blocked itself. A decisive event was the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609, those Muslims who had officially converted to Christianity after the Reconquista, but often secretly held on to their old religion. Over 250,000 people, many of them farmers, craftsmen, and traders, were driven out of the country. This measure, religiously motivated and welcomed by the Church, permanently weakened the economy of entire regions like Valencia. Parallel to this, external pressure grew. With the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618, Spain again entered a devastating religious war with its Habsburg relatives, which soon set all of Central Europe on fire. What began as a denominational conflict soon became a geopolitical power struggle. Spain fought on several fronts simultaneously against Protestant princes, against France, against the Dutch, and against England, a permanent state that devoured men, money, and morale. Particularly dramatic was the resumption of the war against the Netherlands, whose truce ended in 1621. The conflict that now unfolded again was not only expensive, it also became increasingly hopeless. But the actual wounds came from within. In 1640, in the shadow of the exhausting wars, two major uprisings occurred almost simultaneously in Catalonia and Portugal. In Catalonia, a civil war broke out, fueled by tax burdens, cultural tensions, and the attempt to enforce centralist control. In Portugal, the House of Braganza declared independence, and after a decades-long conflict, Spain finally recognized the lost crown in 1668. With this, the Iberian Union, that great dream of reunifying the West, shattered. Another error often encountered is the idea that Spain was weak at this time because it was too religious. In reality, it was the lack of adaptation to modern administrative and economic forms that paralyzed the country. France, England, and the Netherlands developed into market-oriented dynamic nation-states during this phase. Spain, however, held on to the estate-based order, clerical supremacy, and Castilian centralism. A system that proved increasingly inflexible and overwhelmed. And yet, despite all setbacks, Spain remained a power to be reckoned with, but it was now an exhausted power, one that no longer advanced but reacted. In the next chapter we turn our gaze to the tragic symbol of this epoch, Charles II, the Bewitched, a man whose body bore the fragile legacy of his dynasty and whose regency became a silent swan song to an entire age. When Charles II ascended the throne of Spain in 1665, he was just 4 years old and already a tragic figure. Contemporaries later called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But it was no curse in a magical sense that marked him, but a very earthly fate, the legacy of generations of dynastic inbreeding, as it was hardly as pronounced in any ruling family in Europe as in the House of Habsburg. Charles's family tree resembles a closed circle. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Their parents and grandparents had also kept the Habsburg blood pure through numerous intrafamilial connections in the hope of preserving power within the dynasty. But what was intended politically as a strategic alliance became biologically disastrous. Charles was ill, weak, mentally disabled, and physically barely able to move without help. His subjects experienced a king who could hardly articulate himself, whose appearance was described as ghostly, and whose state of health remained a constant state secret. Spain during this time was a country in internal paralysis. While other European powers, above all France under Louis XIV, modernized their administration, strengthened the bourgeoisie and reorganized their armies, Spain froze in a courtly ceremonial that looked more like a theatrical performance than a government. Politics were led by favorites, by queen mothers, Jesuits, and advisors with self-interest. Charles was formally king, but in reality a figure in the background. A monarch without power, who hardly understood what was happening around him. A frequently repeated error is to view Charles II as the cause of Spain's decline, as if his weakness were the reason for the decay. In fact, he was rather a symptom of a deeper problem. The decay had begun long before him. Economic backwardness, military overextension, social dissatisfaction, religious intolerance, and a paralyzing centralism had hollowed out the empire. Charles was the endpoint of a line that could no longer reform itself. Not because there was a lack of ideas, but because the political will to question old structures was missing. His biggest political problem was succession. Charles remained childless, not surprising given his state of health, but catastrophic for the European power structure. For without a clear heir, a dangerous vacuum arose. Both the House of Bourbon in France and the House of Habsburg in Austria claimed the Spanish heritage, and Charles himself wavered for years on whose side he should take. Ultimately, in his will, he appointed Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV. A last attempt to hold the empire together without losing it to Vienna. But this decision triggered what many had feared, a general European war. With the death of Charles II in 1700, the succession conflict was no longer avoidable. The tensions between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs erupted into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the early 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession. The lesson we can draw from this time is sobering and universal at the same time. An empire that refuses any renewal, that suppresses diversity, that concentrates power in the hands of a few, will eventually no longer be viable. Charles II was not to blame for Spain's fall, but he was the mirror of a system that had exhausted itself. In the next chapter, we look at precisely this war that emerged from this exhaustion. A war for power, legitimacy, and identity that brought Spain not only a new dynasty but also fundamentally changed the map of Europe. One last great struggle over the question, who does Spain belong to, and what does it still stand for? When Charles II died in 1700, he left behind not only a decaying state but also a European powder keg. His final decision to appoint the French Prince Philip of Anjou as heir to the Spanish crown was a desperate attempt to breathe new life into the Spanish Empire without leaving it entirely to the Habsburgs. But this decision had far-reaching consequences, for while it was seen in Madrid as a sign of a new beginning, in Vienna, London, and The Hague it was viewed as a threat to the balance of power in Europe. The result was a war that affected almost all of Europe, the War of the Spanish Succession. Between 1701 and 1714, the conflict raged across several theaters, in Flanders, in Italy, on the seas, and in the heart of Spain itself. While the Bourbons under Philip V relied on Castilian loyalty and French help, the Habsburgs mobilized their supporters primarily in Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia. Thus, the war became not only an international struggle for power but also a Spanish civil war. Cities changed sides, neighbors faced each other as enemies, and the country became the battlefield for foreign interests. Perhaps the greatest symbolic loss was the capture of Barcelona in 1714. Catalonia, which had joined the Habsburg cause, lost its traditional freedoms and institutions. With the victory of the Bourbons came not only a new dynasty, but also a new form of state. Philip V, the first Bourbon on the Spanish throne, was deeply influenced by the centralist model of his grandfather, Louis XIV, the Sun King. He did not want a federal monarchy, but a united, uniform Spain. From this arose the famous Nueva Planta decrees, a series of royal edicts that abolished the old rights and special statuses of the former kingdoms within Spain, particularly Aragon and Catalonia. The judicial and tax systems were unified, administration centralized, and the Castilian language declared the dominant official language. It was a radical break with the centuries-old practice of institutionally respecting the diversity of the Spanish Empire. But at the same time, it was the beginning of a modern state, more efficient, ordered, and bureaucratic. A common error lies in seeing this change only negatively. Certainly, it meant the end of regional autonomies, and yes, many of these measures were enforced against the will of large parts of the population. But on the other hand, Spain began to slowly modernize. The Bourbon reforms laid the foundation for later economic renewal, improved military organization, and long-term strengthened the authority of the state against a long-privileged aristocracy. Compared to previous centuries, this was a deep cut, not triggered by external conquest, but by internal reorganization. While France had already become the epitome of a centralized state under Louis XIV, and England was taking new paths with its constitutional monarchy, Spain first had to laboriously learn to move between control and participation, unity and diversity. The great lesson of this time is, reforms are painful, especially when they come from outside or arise as a reaction to a crisis. But they can also offer opportunities to break old patterns and create new structures. For Spain, the change to the Bourbons was not a glorious rebirth, but a turning point, a cautious departure toward the future. In the final chapter of our journey, we look at a king who used this new beginning in a particularly pragmatic and surprisingly modern way, Charles III, the silent reformer who wanted to change Spain not through conquest, but through reason and administration, and whose legacy continues to work today. When one thinks today of great monarchs of Spanish history, the names of warrior kings, conquerors, or mystically elevated rulers often come to mind: Ferdinand and Isabella, Charles V, Philip II, figures who wrote history with swords, ships, or symbols. Charles III, on the other hand, was none of these men. Not a warlord, not a pious missionary, and not a son of the Golden Age. And yet, it was he who changed Spain quietly and sustainably in the 18th century through reform, reason, and a rare form of political clarity. Born in Madrid as the son of Philip V, his path to power initially led far from the Spanish capital. As a young man, he ruled as Duke of Parma, then as King of Naples and Sicily, a phase in which he gained his first government experience and shaped his pragmatic, enlightened attitude. Unlike many of his predecessors, Charles viewed the monarchy not as a divinely legitimized end in itself, but as a responsibility. The king, he believed, was the first servant of the state, a thought that stemmed deeply from the spirit of the Enlightenment. When he took over the Spanish crown in 1759, the empire was externally intact but internally exhausted. The Bourbons had tightened the state, but economic development lagged behind the European West. The education system was weak, corruption widespread, and the Inquisition lay like a heavy shadow on the intellectual life of the country. Charles III tackled all these problems with remarkable objectivity, step by step, without pomp, without a show of power. He promoted the expansion of infrastructure, had roads, bridges, canals, and lighthouses built, modernized the administration, simplified the tax system, and created a national bank. He strengthened agriculture, reformed trade policy, and improved living conditions in the cities, especially visible in Madrid, which received a new face under him: broader boulevards, public lighting, and urban green spaces. He brought clever advisors like the minister Campomanes to his side, who tried to bring science, technology, and education to Spain. A decisive step was the gradual pushback of the Inquisition and the influence of the Jesuit order, which he expelled from the country in 1767, not out of hatred for the Church. Charles himself was deeply religious, but because he wanted to free the state from excessive clerical control. Education, he believed, must not be in the hands of those who feared change. In a way, he was ahead of his time and also met with considerable resistance. A common misunderstanding is to dismiss him as a boring reformer, someone who only managed but had no vision. But the opposite is the case. Charles III was perhaps the first Spanish monarch who had a long-term vision of a modern functioning state and who was prepared to make uncomfortable decisions for it. Unlike Louis XIV, he did not want to be an image of God on earth, and unlike Frederick II of Prussia, he did not seek military greatness but civil stability. The lesson from his rule is simple yet profound. Progress does not have to be loud. Sometimes a silent will for change, the courage to question institutions, and the confidence that education, order, and reason achieve more in the long run than battles or decrees are enough. Charles III did not reinvent Spain, but he woke it up. With his death in 1788, an epoch ended that, in retrospect, is considered one of the calmest and most constructive of the Spanish monarchy. But the world outside was changing rapidly. On the horizon, revolutions were approaching, in France, in the American colonies, and soon in its own. And so, at the end of our journey through the Spanish Empire, the question arises: what remains? What does Spain mean? After gold, after faith, after glory and loss. This is the subject of our concluding summary. A final consideration of heritage, identity, and the lessons of an empire that changed the world but almost broke itself in the process. At the end of this journey through the history of Spain, no simple image remains, but a mosaic of brilliance and darkness, of faith and violence, of hope, error, and resistance. Spain was not just an empire of stone, ships, and swords, it was an experiment of humanity. What happens when religious zeal, colonial ambition, and royal will to power collide in a single empire? We saw how a handful of quarreling kingdoms rose, how they united, triumphed, and lost themselves in their own greatness. We encountered rulers who believed they acted on behalf of God, and those who, in the shadow of reason, quietly achieved great things. And we learned that true greatness is measured not by conquests, but by the ability for renewal, self-criticism, and justice. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of this empire. That power never lasts forever, but the way it was used remains in memory. That identity does